Everybody, this is Perch, and answering a viewer question, and really, I think this question can be said to a lot of different stories, not just the one that the reader is talking about. I think this would apply to many different things. This is an evergreen video, if you would. It says, "Hey Perch, I haven't understood the point of Devil's Reign since it was announced, and I still don't get it. I don't usually follow street level booms because they really don't appeal to me. But so I understand that Kingpin somehow became new mayor of New York in a previous book. I'm fine with that. It's comics. Now, just for reference, Devil's Reign. The premise is basically that the Kingpin is, as you said, mayor of New York, and possibly more, maybe running for president. But the Kingpin is taking out kind of his vendetta against superheroes by making superheroes illegal and basically giving powers to his buddies who are supervillains. It's basically a Dark Reign. If you remember, it just still had the word reign in it. That followed up from Secret Invasion when Norman Osborn got to be like head of Shield, and then suddenly he was putting all of his villain buddies. Very similar. Now, if you're a fan of those books, you can point out several nuances, like Daredevil erasing his identity from people's minds helped trigger the Kingpin realizing that superheroes are over the top and he needed to take action. There's definitely some little nuance here, but it's at its heart, it's villain gets in charge and runs amok. All right, back to the question here. But now Kingpin has easily turned public opinion against superheroes because reasons. In doing so, he's then empowered a bunch of low-level criminals as local law enforcement. Somehow Doc Ock casually takes out the Fantastic Four, Iron Man is in hiding, etc. All this as the mayor of New York. Now, mayors can be influential, especially from larger cities, but they can't just take over a city overnight. Even if we ignore all city government, there is the governor who can come in and pardon any hero's Fisk arrests, and that's not even getting into the federal government. And why is Iron Man hiding? I get Spidey and Luke Cage holding up in New York, but Iron Man could literally fly outside city lines to any number of properties he owns outside Manhattan. I don't know. This comic seems like an absolute waste of time to me. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Um, I think this comic fits into kind of this thing that you've heard the term suspension of disbelief. Well, this comic requires a healthy amount of suspension of disbelief in many ways, and I like Chip Zdarsky, and I like kind of what has happened with Daredevil. I think it's a solid read and it's enjoyable, but in many ways it feels like a shadow or a remake. It's like the God, people are gonna hate this comparison. It's like the 2016 Ghostbusters remake, where it's like, yeah, there's a Stay Puft Marshmallow Man, and yeah, there's ghosts, and yeah, there's people who are doing things, but really, the original movie was, pretty good on its own. And the remake is like trying to kind of go for nostalgia a little bit and add a few other things, but it really doesn't make sense because more time has passed. And does any of this make any sense? That's how I feel. Like this comic to me feels like somebody took Civil War and Dark Reign and kind of put them into a blender together and then said, let's do something. Our comics sold pretty good when we were doing that stuff. Let's do something like that stuff. And, there we have it. I think there's probably a very healthy amount of, hey, remember when Trump was president and he was, because remember, these comics are probably pitched a year earlier. So this comic was most likely pitched back when Trump had lost the election, but he wasn't out yet, and January 6th hadn't happened, and they're like, oh man, the abuse of power. For years, we assumed that there'd be some abuse of power books. In fairness, I thought DC would do it with Lex Luthor. Instead, Scott Snyder did the Lex Luthor becomes like a hybrid Martian, and and all that kind of stuff. So I mean, he did it, but in a very different way. I was assuming we'd get the politician villain remake. Just came a little bit later than I thought. I think a lot of comic writers really wanted to do a commentary on Trump through comics. And I'm not saying that this is exactly what that is, because it's not. Again, there's nuance here. But, a lot of the beats are pretty similar. What is the point of the comic? I mean, it's an event, and they'll do things. You're pointing out kind of one of the two biggest plot holes in all this, which is, why is Iron Man hiding? I mean, he lives and does work in a corpse of a Celestial somewhere in, like, where is the Avengers Mountain? It's some remote foreign mountain with snow. and that's where they hang out, the Avengers, because why not? The mansion was too hard to believe. I actually I had I had this debate. Debate is probably a very kind way of saying it, with an editor who may or may not be editing that particular Avengers run, and it's like, well, does really a bunch of Avengers living in a mansion in New York make sense? I mean, who can relate to that? So let's put him in a deceased corpse of a celestial somewhere in snowy, Europe-y type area. Like what? Anyway. Comics, I maintain, are better when you don't think about them. And when I say don't think about them, I mean you don't kind of get too into the plots, because the more you get into the plots, the goofier it all gets in a hurry. And so if you obsess over it, you're just going to get yourself into trouble. And in many ways, I think comics themselves spoil a lot of what's going on. I think that in many cases, customers, fans, people reading the comics are more than happy to kind of just go along with it's comics, kind of like you did, the person writing the note. They're willing to just kind of ignore the obvious plot holes and issues, and just kind of it's comics. It doesn't need to make a whole lot of sense. But every now and then, the comic itself introduces detailed plot. It wants, not that plot's the wrong word, but it starts giving itself excuses. It's like the writer or the editor or people in comics start going, hey, we can't we're not just doing funny books here. We're doing comics, and so they need to make some level of sense. So they invent this logic. It's why DC goes down the bizarre path of inventing logic of, this is how the characters are aging, or Tom Brevoort, like, using a sliding time scale of time, it means the Fantastic Four were actually going up into space sometime in, it was Vietnam, but now it's early Afghanistan, or maybe it's the Gulf War. Like, no, just leave it alone. If you leave it alone, it feels like there's this unspoken truce between the readers and the comic creators. And the truce is basically this: the readers say, we won't think too much about how Iron Man could have been hanging out in the Vietnam War. And we won't think about how the Fantastic Four were doing the space race. We won't think about how Captain America, we don't think about these things. We'll just appreciate that it's comics and it's kind of fun and there's some wacky stuff there. That's what we'll do. In return, you don't rub it in our face that there's some kind of internal logic here. The comic readers, comic customers, are happy to just have these arguments in the comic store about how impossible all this is. We're happy to do it. We're happy to have these nerdy debates. But we don't want you to be embarrassed about our nerdy debates. If we're having this nerdy debate, we don't want you to kind of sit back and get like, oh, we work in an industry with a bunch of people who have nerd debates. And you won't imagine how many writers I've talked to. Writers. Artists never have a problem with this, by the way. It's always writers and sometimes the editors. And they are ashamed and embarrassed about these kind of nerdy debates going on in comic stores. To me, I can always tell somebody, I get along with many people. There's very few people I don't get along with, in real life. But what I try and do is I know I'm going to get along with a person at a deeper level if they have that same kind of inner love of these nerdy debates about things that really don't make as much sense. I like Jeff Thorne. I've liked him from the moment I started talking with him. I like the cut of his jib, if you will, because here's a guy who appreciates these absurd kind of arguments in the comic store. He appreciates it, and he doesn't try and solve them. He doesn't try and get in there and go, well, these nerdy debates are embarrassing. I think less of comics because nerds are talking about this stuff. So therefore, I have to legitimize it by creating this stuff. A long way of saying that's how Devil's Reign feels like to me. It feels like a combination of a, kind of a let's do a storyline that vaguely resembles when we were selling a lot more comics. And let's try and apply some internal logic about, what if superheroes were illegal? And then what would that mean? And Iron Man couldn't do what he does, and that would be terrible. I'm like, you know what? You're all making it way too hard. And nobody wants that. Devil's Reign, I'm sure, will wind up being one of the better events, which is kind of shocking in its own way. Art team is pretty good. Writer, as I said, I like Chip Zdarsky. I think he tries to do a good job, and he usually comes up with entertaining stuff. But the suspension of disbelief that the Kingpin would, as the mayor of New York, have the power to outlaw everything. I mean, he would not. Again, governor could easily override it. Feds could override it. At some point, Iron Man has to. The problem with this is it kind of flies in the face of the great power comes great responsibility. So, okay, Iron Man, you're willing to go into hiding, and therefore, potentially, people will get mugged, killed, shot, fall off roofs, whatever happens, because you're less active out there trying to save lives. So you have the power to save lives. You have the power to fairly easily evade, Fisk's rule. Like I said, like the writer said, you could just fly into the next county. You'll be fine. In fact, with your jets, you can fly into space in what, 3 seconds? Like you'd be okay. Are you worried that if you save somebody's life in New York and then like Doc Ock and his evil team shows up that you can't just like quickly go, well, I can't win this battle, so I'm going to have to hop on up to Vermont. You could be in Vermont in 2-3 seconds. The character brags about this. It doesn't make. This is the problem. Storylines should not introduce exactly the kind of stuff that I'm talking about right now. Anyway, let me know if you like this event. What do you think? Is it a little bit silly, redundant? Let me know in the comments below. Like and subscribe, of course. And thanks for listening.